In one of the darkest periods of the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius ascended to the throne. But he was no ordinary emperor. He was a philosopher. He was the last whisper of an age, the final light of the Pax Romana. A man who inherited a world on fire and tried to meet the flames not with ambition, but with introspection. This is not just the story of an emperor. It is the story of a human soul, caught between the crushing weight of absolute power and the unwavering pursuit of inner peace. This is the saga of the man who ruled the known world, but sought only to rule himself. Our story begins not on a throne, but in a quiet home, in the heart of Rome, in the year 121 AD. He was born Marcus Annius Verus, a child of privilege, descended from a prominent family of Spanish origin. From his very first breath, he was marked by destiny. The reigning emperor, Hadrian, a restless, brilliant, and complex man, saw something in the young boy. Hadrian was a keen judge of character, and in Marcus, he saw a quality that was rare in the Roman aristocracy, an almost unnatural sincerity. He nicknamed the boy Verissimus, the most true. It was a name that would define his entire existence. While other boys of his rank were taught the arts of war, politics, and social climbing, Marcus was drawn to the inner world. His education was a grand project, curated by the emperor himself. He was given the finest minds in Rome as his guides. But this was not an education merely of facts and figures. It was an education of the soul. Imagine a young Marcus, wrapped in the simple, coarse cloak of a philosopher, which he adopted at the tender age of 11. Shocking the Roman court, he slept on a hard plank bed, rejecting the comforts of his station. He was training himself, even then, for a different kind of battle. His tutors were a pantheon of thinkers. There was Diognetus, the painter, who taught him to see the world with an artist's eye, but also to see through the illusions of fame, wealth, and power. He taught Marcus to question the superficial, to look for the substance beneath the paint. Then came Cornelius Fronto, the most celebrated orator of his day, a master of Latin rhetoric. Fronto loved Marcus dearly, writing him countless letters filled with affection and lessons on the beauty of language. He wanted Marcus to be a great speaker, a mover of crowds. But Marcus, while he respected his teacher, felt a growing emptiness in the pursuit of beautiful words. What good was eloquence if the soul behind it was hollow? What good was persuading the Senate if one could not persuade oneself to be virtuous? The true turning point came with a man named Junius Rusticus. Rusticus was not a showman like Fronto. He was a stern, dedicated follower of Stoicism. He didn't offer Marcus flowery phrases. He offered him a framework for living. He placed in the young man's hands the discourses of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the greatest Stoic masters. For Marcus, reading Epictetus was like finding a map to his own mind. Suddenly the world clicked into place. The Stoic philosophy, born centuries before in the painted colonnades of Athens, resonated with his very being. It was a philosophy of granite. It taught him that the world is divided into two parts, that which is in our control and that which is not. Our health, our wealth, our reputation, the actions of others, the storms, the plagues, the wars, these are not in our control. They are indifferents. To waste energy worrying about them, raging against them, or craving them is the source of all human misery. And what is in our control? Only one thing, our own mind. Our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our virtue. This was the revelation. Philosophy was not a hobby for dusty academics. It was a practical daily discipline. It was the forging of an inner citadel, a fortress within the mind that no external event, no matter how terrible, could ever breach. He learned of the Logos, the divine reason that governs the universe, a rational force in which every event, good or bad, has a purpose. His job was not to fight the Logos, but to align himself with it, to accept his fate with tranquility, and to perform his duty to the common good of humanity. For 23 years, he lived this life. He was a student, a thinker, a quiet nobleman. He married, he had children, he studied law, but all the while, the shadow of the purple robe loomed. The reluctant Caesar Hadrian's plan for succession was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. He had no son. He first adopted a man named Lucius Aelius, but Aelius died young. So, Hadrian turned his gaze to a respected senator, Antoninus. He adopted Antoninus, who would be known as Antoninus Pius, on one condition: that Antoninus, in turn, adopt two sons. One was the young son of the deceased Aelius, Lucius Verus. The other was Marcus. Marcus Aurelius was now the heir to the heir. He was horrified. We have his letters. He wrote to Fronto, his old tutor, lamenting this destiny. He did not want the palace. He wanted the philosopher's cloak. He wanted a life of quiet contemplation, of books, of family. He wrote, "I would rather live in a small cottage than in that palace, full of anxieties." But the Logos had set his path. A Stoic does not shirk his duty. In 138 AD, Hadrian died. Antoninus Pius became emperor. And for the next 23 years, Rome experienced its golden afternoon. The reign of Antoninus was so peaceful, so prosperous, that it is almost a blank page in the history books. And all this time, Marcus was at his side learning. It was the longest, most stable apprenticeship an emperor ever had. Antoninus was a model of calm, steady governance. He was not a glamorous warrior or a brilliant orator. He was simply a good man. He managed the empire like a careful household. Marcus watched, he learned, and he waited. He served as consul. He studied law. He participated in the Senate. But his personal life, during this time of public peace, was a private proving ground for his philosophy. He had married Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus. Their marriage, by all accounts, was a loving one, though it was shadowed by immense tragedy. Faustina bore him at least 13 children. We do not know all their names. We only know that most of them died. One by one, they were taken by illness, by the fragility of life in the ancient world. Imagine Marcus, the devoted father, the Stoic student, standing over the small, cold body of a child. This is where the philosophy met the flesh. Could he still believe in a rational universe? Could he still accept fate when it was so cruel? This was the fire that forged him. He trained himself to see death not as a tragedy, but as a natural process, a return to the elements. He taught himself to love his family, but to hold them loosely, understanding that they were, like all things, borrowed. In 161 AD, the long, quiet reign of Antoninus Pius came to an end. The old emperor died peacefully in his bed. The Senate, the army, and the people of Rome turned to one man, Marcus Aurelius. He was 40 years old. The moment he had dreaded his entire life had arrived, and his first act as sole ruler of the Roman Empire was to refuse. He would not accept the power unless it was shared. He insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be made co-emperor with equal power. This had never happened before. Rome had two Augusti. It was an act of incredible humility and a profound philosophical choice. Marcus believed in the shared burden, in the danger of absolute power corrupting one man. He, the introspective student, would handle the law and the administration in Rome. The charismatic, handsome, and more martial Lucius Verus would handle the military. It was a perfect plan. It lasted barely a moment. The Logos had other ideas. The long peace of Antoninus had been a calm before the most terrible storm in Roman history. The day Marcus and Lucius took the throne, the river Tiber flooded, devastating Rome. Famine followed, and then from the east came word of war. The Parthian Empire, Rome's ancient enemy, had invaded, shattering the Roman legions in Armenia. Lucius Verus was dispatched to the east. The war was long and difficult, but eventually Roman discipline prevailed. Lucius returned to Rome a conquering hero, celebrating a magnificent triumph. But he brought something back with him, something far deadlier than Parthian arrows. His legions, marching home from the depths of Asia, carried a passenger. It was a disease. We call it the Antonine plague, likely a virulent form of smallpox. It swept through the empire like wildfire. It was an apocalypse. At its height, it killed thousands a day in the city of Rome alone. The historian Cassius Dio, an eyewitness, wrote of carts piled high with the dead. The plague respected no one. It hollowed out the army. It decimated the Senate. It emptied the countryside. It would rage on and off for nearly 25 years, killing, by some estimates, a quarter of the entire population. And as the empire reeled, as the smoke from the funeral pyres choked the sky, the true threat emerged. On the northern frontier, along the vast cold expanse of the Danube River, the tribes were stirring. The emperor's soul, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, names that struck fear into the Roman heart. Driven by the pressure of migrating Goths from the far north, and sensing Rome's weakness from the plague, they burst across the frontier in a torrent of violence. They overran Roman defences, slaughtered a Roman legion, and poured into Italy itself. For the first time in centuries, a barbarian army was on Italian soil. The storm had broken. The philosopher who had wanted a library was now a general. The man who had dreamed of tranquility was now the sole commander of a dying world. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died suddenly in 169 AD, possibly from the plague, leaving Marcus alone to face the deluge. The treasury was empty, bankrupted by the Parthian War and the plague's disruption. The army was a skeleton crew, its ranks ravaged by disease. Marcus had to raise new legions, enrolling gladiators, slaves, and even bandits. To fund this desperate war, he did something unprecedented. He walked through the imperial palace and ordered a public auction of the empire's treasures. Imperial robes woven with gold, jewel-encrusted goblets, priceless statues. His wife Faustina's silk gowns, all were sold. He stripped the palace bare to save the state. And then, for the next decade, he went to war. This is the crucible. This is where the man becomes the legend. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, spent almost the entire rest of his life not in Rome, but on the frozen, muddy banks of the Danube. He lived in a soldier's tent in places like Carnuntum, a fortress on the edge of nowhere. And it is here, in the heart of darkness, that he wrote one of the most profound works of human literature. He did not write it for us. He did not write it for publication. He called it simply Ta Eis Houten, to himself. We call it the Meditations. It is a book written in the pre-dawn cold, by the light of a flickering oil lamp, before a day of reviewing troops, planning strategy, and judging cases of life and death. It is not a book of philosophy. It is the practice of philosophy. It is a man's desperate, brilliant, and heartbreaking attempt to keep his own soul intact. The pages are filled with notes, scribbled in Greek, the language of philosophy. They are raw, repetitive, and urgent. He is not teaching, he is reminding himself. He writes to brace himself for the day. Say to yourself in the morning, "Today I shall meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, and unsocial. I cannot be harmed by any of them, for no one can implicate me in what is degrading." He writes to cope with the stress of command, the failures of his generals, the betrayals of his allies. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. He writes as he watches his men die, as he feels his own body sicken and age. The world is a river of passing events. What is instantly swept away, and another is coming, and that too will be swept away. He repeats, Alexander the Great and his stable boy, both reduced to the same thing, either taken back into the same logos or scattered into atoms. He fights against despair, against the temptation to cynicism. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. He writes of his duty, the one thing that keeps him going. He sees the Roman Empire not as a tool for his own glory, but as a common good he is bound to protect. He compares himself to a bee in a hive. What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee. His personal happiness, his desire for peace, his longing for his books, all must be sacrificed for the hive. This journal was his inner citadel. The war raged around him. The plague festered in his camps. His body ached with chronic illness. But in his mind he was free. He was the master of his own domain. He could not control the barbarians, or the plague, or the actions of his court, but he could control his perception of them. He could choose to meet chaos with tranquility, betrayal with forgiveness, and his crushing duty with unwavering virtue. The storm on the frontier, the Marcomannic Wars, were a brutal, grinding slog. This was not a war of grand, sweeping victories, but of grim, desperate survival. It was a war of icy river crossings, of ambushes in dark, primeval forests, of entire seasons spent in the saddle riding the line, bolstering defences. Marcus was not a natural general, but he was a dutiful one. He was methodical, resilient, and above all present. He shared the hardships of his men. He did not command from a distant palace. He commanded from the frontier. This philosopher, who cringed at the violence of the gladiatorial games, now presided over a decade of unceasing slaughter. There were moments of despair. In one famous campaign, a Roman army under his command was surrounded by the Quadi, trapped in a barren, waterless valley. The sun beat down. The legionaries were dying of thirst. The barbarians were closing in for the kill. It seemed to be the end. And then the miracle of the thundering legion occurred. As Cassius Dio tells it, an Egyptian magician prayed to Hermes, and a sudden violent thunderstorm broke. The Romans, catching the rain in their shields and helmets, were saved. The lightning from the storm struck the Quadi, throwing them into disarray, and the revitalized Romans counterattacked and won a stunning victory. Christian writers later claimed it was the prayers of Christian soldiers in the legion that saved them. Roman propagandists, on the other hand, minted coins showing Marcus protected by Jupiter, the wielder of the thunderbolt. Whatever the cause, it was a turning point. Marcus, the relentless, methodical emperor, began to push the tribes back. He crossed the Danube, taking the war into their territory. His plan was ambitious. He would not just defeat them, He would annex their lands, creating 2 new Roman provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, to create a permanent buffer for Italy. He was on the verge of total victory. He had broken the back of the resistance. He had secured the frontier for a generation. And then, betrayal. In 175 AD, a message arrived from the east. Avidius Cassius, the brilliant general who had served him faithfully, the governor of Syria, had declared himself emperor. Cassius had heard a rumor, perhaps spread deliberately, that Marcus was dead. He seized control of the entire eastern half of the empire. This was the ultimate test of the inner citadel. Marcus, his body racked with illness, and his mind exhausted from the war, now faced a catastrophic civil war. His own general, a man he trusted, had stabbed him in the back. How did the philosopher react? We have his words. He gathered his soldiers, who were enraged and ready to march on Cassius. But Marcus did not give a speech of anger. He gave a speech of sorrow. He lamented not his own betrayal, but the fact that a friend had fallen from virtue. He told his men his one great wish, that Cassius not be killed, so that Marcus could meet him, forgive him, and show the world how a philosopher handles an enemy. He was spared the choice. Avidius Cassius was assassinated by one of his own centurions after only 3 months. The civil war was over before it began. Marcus, true to his word, pardoned Cassius's family. He ordered the letters of the conspirators to be burned, unread, so that he would not be forced to hold a grudge. He made a brief tour of the east to restore order, where his wife, Faustina, who had been with him on campaign, died suddenly in a small village. Another loss, another test of acceptance. He returned to Rome for the first time in 8 years, celebrated a triumph for his northern victories, and then, immediately, turned around and went back to the frozen frontier. The war was not finished. His duty was not done. The philosophy of governance. To understand Marcus Aurelius, we must understand the paradox of his rule. He was a man of absolute power who was deeply suspicious of power. He was a philosopher of kindness who presided over a brutal world. His daily routine when he was in Rome was a model of Stoic discipline. He rose before dawn. He would meditate, reading the words of Epictetus, bracing his mind for the day. He would then meet with his advisors, read petitions, and spend long, grueling hours in the law courts. He was known as a meticulous, almost obsessive legal scholar. While other emperors grew bored with the minutiae of law, Marcus saw it as the practical application of justice. He passed laws protecting slaves from arbitrary cruelty, laws securing the rights of widows and orphans, laws that reformed the complexities of inheritance. He saw the law as the logos made manifest, the rational ordering of the human hive. He was accessible. Any citizen could in theory petition him. He was patient, listening to endless disputes. He was the servant of the state, not its master. But this portrait of the benevolent philosopher king is stained by one dark, undeniable reality: the persecution of Christians. Under his reign, Christians were arrested, tried, and executed, sometimes in horrific public spectacles like the martyrs of Lyons. How could this be? How could the man who wrote the Meditations, the man who preached tolerance and the common good, allow this? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. To Marcus, Stoicism was reason, and Roman religion, the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was the sacred tradition that held the hive together. The Christians were, in his view, a dangerous, irrational cult. They refused to sacrifice to the emperor's genius. They spoke of a king other than Caesar. They met in secret. They were stubborn. To a Stoic, Stubbornness in the face of reason was a vice. In a time of plague, war, and famine, Marcus believed the gods were angry. The Christians, by refusing to honor the gods, were endangering the entire state. They were a threat to the logos, a sickness in the body politic. His persecution was not a fit of rage. It was, in his mind, the regrettable but necessary act of a surgeon removing a cancer to save the patient. It is the great tragic contradiction of his life. His philosophy of personal virtue blinded him to a new idea of faith. His final contradiction, and his greatest tragedy, was not in the state, but in his own family. The philosopher king, the master of his own mind, had a son. Commodus Marcus had broken with the tradition of the 5 good emperors, who had all adopted worthy successors. Marcus had a biological son, and he loved him. He made Commodus co-emperor, trained him, and kept him by his side during the wars. But Commodus was different. He was not a philosopher. He was an athlete, a narcissist, a man drawn to the brutality of the arena. He was everything Marcus was not. In 180 AD, on the northern frontier near the city of Vindobona, modern Vienna, the long war was finally winding down. Marcus was on the brink of achieving his grand strategic goal. But his body, worn down by decades of stress, chronic illness, and the harsh life of the camp, was failing. He knew he was dying. He called his friends and his son to his bedside. He spoke to them not of his own pain, but of his worry for the empire. He pleaded with his son to finish the war, to put his duty to Rome above all else. Then he stopped eating and drinking, a final act of Stoic acceptance. On March the 17th, 180 AD, the last of the good emperors died. His son, Commodus, did not finish the war. He immediately declared victory, bribed the tribes for a hasty peace, abandoned his father's hard-won territory, and raced back to Rome to enjoy the pleasures of the palace. The reign of Commodus would be a disaster of megalomania and terror, plunging the empire into a chaos from which it would never truly recover. The golden age was over. The philosopher's son had become a tyrant. So what is the legacy of Marcus Aurelius? Was he a failure? His war was left unfinished. His son destroyed his work. His philosophy could not stop the persecutions. But to judge him by his results is to miss the point of the man himself. Marcus Aurelius never sought to change the world. He sought to change himself. He was the one man in history who was given ultimate power, and he found it to be an unbearable burden. He was a man who wanted nothing, yet was responsible for everything. His meditations were never meant to be read, yet they have survived for 18 centuries, a timeless guide for soldiers, presidents, artists, and anyone struggling to find tranquility in a chaotic world. He shows us that philosophy is not something you read. It is something you do. It is a battle fought daily in the quiet of your own mind. He was the emperor who ruled the world, but his true kingdom was his inner citadel. He was the philosopher who became a king, and in the end, he was simply a man, writing in a cold tent by a dark river, reminding himself and us how to be human.